The courtroom was full, every seat taken, every phone recording, and every whisper hanging in the air like a warning of something big that was about to happen, something no one was ready for. The tall officer stood in front of the woman in the black suit, his shoulders stiff, his jaw tight, and his eyes locked on her like she was a threat. She didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. She just stared at him with a calmness that made the room colder, like she was waiting for something she already knew was coming. The judge wasn't on the bench yet. The lawyers whispered in corners, reporters adjusted their cameras, and people leaned forward in their seats, sensing a storm that hadn't broken yet. The air felt heavy, pressing down on everyone's chest. The officer took a slow step forward, the sound of his boots hitting the floor echoing through the room. The woman stood perfectly still, her hands resting on the wooden table in front of her, her back straight, her breathing steady. The officer was used to fear. He was used to people stepping back, lowering their heads, begging for space, but she gave him nothing. Her stillness made him uneasy. He clenched his jaw tighter, and the whispers around them faded into silence. He muttered something low, something meant to intimidate, but she didn't react. His hand twitched. Then, without warning, it happened. His arm swung fast, and his palm crashed against her face with a sharp, cracking sound that bounced off the walls like a gunshot. Gasps ripped through the crowd. Some people jerked in their seats, others pulled out their phones faster, zooming in to catch every second. The officer's hand hung in the air for a second, the courtroom frozen like time itself had stopped. Her head tilted slightly from the impact, her dark hair brushing against her shoulders, but she didn't fall. She didn't stumble. She didn't cry. Slowly, like a storm rising from the sea, she lifted her chin, her cold, steady eyes locking on his face. No words, no fear, just a quiet kind of power that made his heartbeat falter for a split second. He expected her to break, to shout, to collapse, but she didn't. She just stood there like steel, silent and dangerous. A man in the back whispered something, someone else gasped again. The sound of a phone recording beeped softly, and still, she didn't move. The officer shifted his weight, suddenly unsure of himself. He had slapped people before. He had seen many faces filled with fear, shame, and panic. But this was different. This was like slapping a wall that slapped back without touching you. There was something about the way she stood, the way she looked at him, the way her hands stayed steady on the table, that sent a chill down his spine. He didn't know her. No one in that room really did. They thought she was just another woman fighting a small case against a powerful HOA, someone the system could silence easily. But they were wrong. She wasn't a nobody. She wasn't weak. This moment, the slap, the silence, the cameras, the whispers, was exactly what she had waited for. The officer didn't realize it yet, but the second his hand touched her, he had stepped into a trap. Not the kind you could see, but the kind carefully built with time, with proof, with power. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was the beginning of something none of them expected. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them. The judge was finally entering the room. But now, the story of this courtroom had already changed. What started as a slap would end as something far more dangerous. And the woman standing in black knew exactly how this would play out, because she wasn't here to lose. She was here to end everything. Before that day in the courtroom, everything had started quietly, far away from cameras, reporters, and crowds. It began in her neighborhood, the place where she had tried to build a simple life, a home, a place where she could breathe after years of fighting battles that most people never even heard about. The HOA board had spotted her the day she moved in, a woman living alone in a strong, clean black house at the corner of the street, a house that didn't bow down to their rules. They didn't like her confidence. They didn't like the way she walked like she didn't owe them anything. They didn't like the way she ignored their fake smiles. It started with small things, letters about grass being too long when it wasn't, warnings about paint color that was already approved, and fines for community violations that never even happened. She threw the letters away at first, thinking it was just petty control, the usual HOA game that faded when people ignored it. But it didn't fade. The letters became threats, the threats turned into visits, and the visits came with people trying to intimidate her at her door. The HOA president, a woman with a plastic smile and a dangerous ego, made it her personal mission to break her. But what the board didn't know was that she had seen far worse than them. She had spent years standing in courtrooms, watching powerful people fall because they thought they were untouchable. So she stayed quiet, collected everything, and let them think she was weak. The harassment grew slowly, like a snake tightening around her house. They blocked her driveway, they sent notices claiming her fence violated rules. They even shut down her security cameras once by cutting the neighborhood power line for maintenance. Most people would have given up, sold the house, left the neighborhood. That was what they expected. That was their game. But she didn't run. Every letter was kept, every fake fine was copied, every voice that threatened her was recorded. They laughed behind closed doors, calling her just another homeowner. But what they didn't understand was that she was building a wall they could never climb over. And when they finally dragged her to court, they thought they had one. They believed their connections, their friends in the local office, their handshakes with the police would silence her. They didn't know the fire they had walked into. The officer who slapped her that morning wasn't chosen by accident. He was part of the HOA's plan to break her spirit in front of everyone. They wanted her to lose control, to scream, to give them a reason to say she was unstable. They wanted to show power, to crush her publicly so others in the neighborhood would fall in line. But they made one mistake, a mistake they didn't even see. They underestimated her. She wasn't just a woman in a black suit. She was a storm that had been waiting to strike. Behind her calm silence was a plan, one that started the day the first letter showed up on her porch. She had spoken to people higher than the board, people the board didn't even know existed. She had files stacked neatly in a folder, files with dates, signatures, audio recordings, legal violations, and a list of every illegal thing the HOA had done. And she had time on her side. While they mocked her at meetings, she was in the city records office pulling documents. While they tried to corner her with fake violations, she was quietly talking to state investigators. While they thought they were making her weak, she was making her case stronger. And all of it, every piece of paper, every recording, every silent step she took, was leading to one place, the courtroom. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about control, power, and who would stand at the end. The HOA board wanted to scare her. They wanted to humiliate her. But she was counting down the days until she could bring everything to light. That morning, when she walked through the courthouse doors in her black suit, she wasn't just walking into a fight. She was walking into her moment. She knew they would try something. She knew they were desperate. And when the officer lifted his hand and hit her, he didn't just slap a woman. He triggered a chain reaction that would burn their little empire to the ground. She had waited a long time for this, and now, the war they started on her front porch was about to end right where they thought they had the upper hand. The woman who once received their threats now held the match that would set their power on fire. And the board didn't even know it yet. They had no idea the quiet woman they bullied was about to become the storm they couldn't control. The courtroom felt different after the slap, like something heavy had shifted in the air but no one fully understood it yet. The officer stood there stiff, pretending he was in control, but his heartbeat had already started to race, because the way she stared at him made the ground under his boots feel unsteady. The HOA president sat 2 rows back, a small smirk on her face, thinking everything was going exactly as planned. She had spent weeks setting this moment up, whispering to the right people, pushing the right buttons, and pulling the right strings. She thought bringing an officer to stand close to the woman would make her crack, make her lash out, make her look guilty in front of the judge and cameras. They believed fear would do the job for them. But fear didn't work on someone who had already lived through worse storms. They had no idea that the woman in black wasn't cornered. She was waiting. The officer's slap was supposed to humiliate her, but instead, it gave her the exact moment she needed, the spark she had been waiting to unleash everything she had been holding back. Behind the calm in her eyes was a map, a carefully built trap that the HOA board and the police had walked straight into without realizing it. She had recorded every single violation, every meeting, every whispered threat that came from the board members. She had copies of signatures they forged to push illegal fines. She had video proof of them shutting off her power during a storm. She had names, dates, faces, everything lined up like chess pieces waiting to be knocked down. And most dangerous of all, she had already handed copies to people outside the courtroom. People who didn't bow to the HOA's influence. So even if they tried to silence her here, the truth would still explode out there. The officer didn't know it, but the moment his hand touched her, the trap had already snapped shut around him, around the HOA president, around every person who thought they could bury her with fear. The board had made their most dangerous move in secret. A week before the trial, they tried to corner her with a fake emergency meeting where they announced that if she lost this case, they would seize her house for unpaid community dues. They had planned it like a show. They brought local police in their pocket, reporters they paid, and lawyers they controlled. They thought they were so smart, but she had been there quietly too, listening, recording, watching them tie their own noose with every word. She didn't shout, she didn't argue, she let them believe they were winning. That was her strength. She let them walk right into the story she was writing. And in that courtroom, as the officer's hand still tingled with the sting of the slap he threw, the tension wrapped around everyone's throat. People in the gallery whispered, unsure if they were witnessing a simple outburst or the beginning of something much bigger. The HOA president crossed her legs and straightened her jacket, trying to look powerful, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. Somewhere deep inside, something told her she had just made a mistake. The woman in black raised her chin slowly and looked toward the empty judge's bench. She didn't say a single word, but the silence itself screamed louder than anything she could have spoken. The officer stepped back slightly, not because anyone told him to, but because something in his gut told him this wasn't going to end the way they planned. He could feel the weight of dozens of phones recording, dozens of eyes staring, and something in her stillness that made him uneasy. The bailiff cleared his throat awkwardly. One of the lawyers at the table whispered nervously to another. And through it all, she didn't blink. This wasn't the reaction they expected. They wanted her to lose control, but instead, she made everyone else in the room feel like they were the ones losing it. Behind her calm expression was years of quiet work. She had built her case piece by piece like a puzzle. She knew this wasn't just about a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was about power. The HOA had crossed lines for years: harassment, extortion, threats, illegal fines, and they had done it because nobody ever fought back. But she wasn't like everyone else. She had worked in places where men with bigger power than this board had fallen in a single afternoon. She had seen how fragile power becomes when it meets the truth. So she waited, patient and quiet, letting them play their little game until the perfect moment came to burn their empire down. The officer didn't know that his handprint wasn't just on her cheek. It was now written in the case file that would follow him for the rest of his life. The HOA president didn't know that every deal she made in the dark would soon be dragged into the light. The people whispering didn't know they were witnessing the beginning of the end of something much bigger than a fine. And the woman in black didn't need to tell anyone. She just needed to stand there, silent, steady, dangerous. The trap was already set. All she had to do now was wait for the judge to walk in and let their own actions destroy them. The board thought they were pushing her down, but what they didn't understand was this. The moment they raised their hand against her, they gave her the power to bring everything crashing down. The courtroom doors opened slowly and the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall, pulling everyone's attention toward the front. The judge entered, his face firm and unreadable, the kind of face that had seen too many lies to be fooled easily. The moment he stepped onto the platform, the whispers died like a flame in the wind. Cameras stopped shaking, lawyers straightened their backs. Even the officer who had slapped the woman took a small step away from her as if the ground under his feet had started to shift. She didn't move, didn't look shaken. She just stood tall with the same calm that had burned its way through the entire room. But behind her silence now was something louder than any voice: control. She wasn't reacting to the courtroom. The courtroom was reacting to her. The judge took his seat, and the silence stretched until it wrapped around everyone's chest like a tight rope. He looked down at the file on the desk in front of him, but his eyes flicked up, sharp, landing on the woman in black, then the officer, then the HOA president sitting stiffly in the back. He didn't need anyone to explain what had just happened. He had seen the slap, he had heard the gasp, and he had noticed the quiet fire in her eyes that most people couldn't hide even if they tried. The bailiff announced the case in a low voice, but no one was really listening. Everyone was staring at the three people who held the center of this storm. The woman finally raised her hand slightly, not to speak, but to pass a thick black folder to her lawyer. That simple movement, quiet and slow, carried more power than a shout ever could. Her lawyer stood and placed the folder on the table in front of the judge. The sound of the file hitting the wood echoed through the courtroom, a sound so sharp it made the HOA president flinch just a little. The judge opened the folder, and what he saw inside made his expression shift, just barely, but enough to make those who were watching feel it. Page after page of records, photos, documents, signatures, letters, bank statements, audio logs, video stills, an entire web of corruption carefully stacked together over months. It wasn't just a case. It was a bomb waiting to explode. The HOA president's smirk faded like it had never been there. Her hand moved nervously to fix her hair. The officer's jaw tightened. He had no idea what was in that folder, but something in the judge's face told him it wasn't good for anyone who stood on the wrong side of it. The woman didn't need to speak. She had already won the first step. The judge leaned forward, tapping one finger lightly on the papers, his eyes moving slowly from the folder to the officer. "Is this true?" he asked in a calm but cold voice. The officer swallowed hard but didn't answer. He wasn't used to being on this side of the pressure. The HOA president opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. For the first time since this war began, she wasn't in control of the stage. The woman lowered her eyes for a second, not out of fear but almost like she was giving them one last chance to understand the mistake they made. When she lifted her gaze again, there was no mercy in it. Her silence now was heavier than any accusation. It carried months of pain, months of being targeted, pushed, threatened, treated like she didn't matter. But what they didn't know back then was that she wasn't the kind of person who broke. She was the kind of person who let others dig their own graves. The judge turned a page, then another, and with every turn, the faces of the HOA members sitting behind grew paler. Every line on those papers was a piece of their hidden world ripped out into the open. A reporter in the corner adjusted his camera, sensing something big. The woman's lawyer started reading parts of the evidence out loud, his voice steady, cutting through the room like a knife. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. Each word was heavy, each fact a punch that landed on the board's pride. Illegal fines, harassment, forged approvals, personal threats, misuse of police authority. Every single thing they had built their control on was being stripped away piece by piece. The officer who slapped her was now shifting his weight from one leg to the other, sweat slowly gathering on his forehead even in the cool air of the courtroom. The HOA president's breathing grew shallow. The judge raised a hand, stopping the lawyer. The silence that followed was worse than anything else. Everyone knew what that kind of silence meant. The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers folded together, his eyes burning holes through the people who had walked into this courtroom thinking they were untouchable. Then he turned to the woman, the only one in the room who hadn't broken under the weight of the moment. "You've been waiting for this, haven't you?" he said slowly, not as a question but like a fact. She didn't nod. She didn't smile. She just stood there, straight and still, like the storm she had been building for months had finally reached the center of the board. The HOA president tried to speak, tried to spin some lie about misunderstanding, but the judge raised a hand again, shutting her down before the first excuse left her mouth. She knew then, just from the look on his face, that she was no longer in control. Her power had been ripped out from under her like a rug, and she hadn't even realized when it happened. The officer shifted again, but there was nowhere to go. Every camera in that room was pointed at him, at her, at the mess they had created. The woman in black didn't need to say a single word. The papers had already done all the talking. The judge straightened his robe, gave one long look at the folder, and then at the faces of those who once thought they could crush her. The trap she had set months ago was now fully closed around them, and there was no way out. This was the moment she had waited for, the moment she knew would come the second she decided not to run but to fight. The slap had been their weapon. But the truth, that was hers. And in this room, The truth was louder than power. It was the storm, and they were standing in its path. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier with every passing second, wrapping around everyone like a thick invisible rope, and for the first time since this entire war began, the people who had always felt untouchable now looked like they were standing on thin, cracking glass. The officer's shoulders were no longer stiff with power. They were tight with fear. His eyes flicked around the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The HOA president's legs were pressed together, her hands clutching her bag so hard that her knuckles had turned white. Her mind raced through every lie she had told, every backdoor deal, every meeting where she had laughed while ruining someone else's life. The woman in the black suit stood straight at the center of it all, quiet, still, dangerous. She didn't smile, she didn't move, but the power in the room had already shifted to her. Everyone could feel it, even those who didn't understand how they ended up being part of something far bigger than a neighborhood dispute. The judge leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the polished wood of the bench, and his voice came out steady, low, and cold, the kind of voice that made even the strongest liars feel small. "Do you understand the weight of what I've just read?" he asked, not because he wanted an answer, but because he wanted the question to crush them. The HOA president opened her mouth to speak, but her voice cracked on the first syllable, and she stopped herself. She had no speech to give, no charm to spin, no lie big enough to bury what was already spread out in front of everyone. The officer didn't even try to speak. He knew anything that came out of his mouth now would be torn apart by the evidence that she had built piece by piece, silently and patiently. The lawyer working with her took a step forward and started to read more documents aloud. Each line was like a hammer slamming down on the board's fake empire. Bank transfers from community funds into private accounts, fake violation notices with forged inspector signatures, emails sent to silence homeowners who asked too many questions, even audio recordings where the HOA president bragged about how easy it was to control people with fear. With every piece of truth that came out, their confidence bled away. Reporters scribbled down notes faster, cameras clicked, the gallery leaned forward, and the room grew warmer with the heat of everything that was being exposed. The judge didn't need to ask for more. The evidence spoke for itself. The officer's hands twitched at his sides. A few minutes ago, he thought he was in charge. The man in uniform standing tall in front of a woman he believed couldn't fight back. But now, standing under the weight of the truth, his badge didn't feel like protection anymore. It felt like a target. His breathing grew shallow, and the small bead of sweat running down his temple betrayed the fear he was trying to hide. The HOA president sat frozen, blinking fast like she could wake up from a nightmare. But this wasn't a nightmare. It was the end of everything she had built on lies. The judge finally turned his eyes to the woman in black. "You've been ready for this," he said slowly, and this time it wasn't a question. It was a statement, heavy with the kind of respect no one expected to be shown to her when the day began. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her stillness was louder than any reply. For months, they called her weak. For months, they pushed her, mocked her, cornered her. They thought she would give up. But instead, she collected their sins one by one, waited for the right moment, and now here they were, caught, stripped, and exposed in front of the world. The judge gave a sharp nod to the bailiff, who immediately walked toward the officer. The room stiffened. The officer's eyes widened slightly, the first real crack in his expression. His hand twitched like he wanted to step back but couldn't. The bailiff's voice was firm. "You're being detained pending investigation." The words hit him harder than any punch ever could. The courtroom reacted like a wave crashing. Whispers, gasps, camera shutters firing like gunfire. The officer's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue, he couldn't. The uniform he wore had just turned against him. The HOA president's breathing quickened. She shifted in her seat, her eyes darting between the judge and the woman in black like she was watching a closing door. And then came the second blow. The judge turned his cold stare toward her and said, "You will be formally charged for multiple counts of fraud, extortion, and harassment." The president's hand trembled. For the first time, she looked small, like a queen whose crown had been ripped off in front of her court. She tried to open her mouth, but nothing came out. Not a single excuse could save her now. The woman in black watched it all happen quietly. Her heart didn't race. Her hands didn't shake. This wasn't revenge driven by chaos. It was justice built with patience. She had endured everything they threw at her, not because she was weak, but because she was building something they couldn't destroy. All those nights of sitting alone with files spread across her table, all the phone calls, the recordings, the letters, the quiet battles nobody saw. This was the moment they were all leading to. As the officer was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs and the HOA president's face drained of its last bit of color, the judge looked back at her, and in that single look was an acknowledgement of what she had done. Alone, against an entire system that thought she couldn't win. The audience in the courtroom didn't move or speak. They were seeing something no one expected to see that morning. She wasn't the woman being cornered anymore. She was the woman holding the fire. The HOA's reign over her neighborhood had crumbled in minutes. The cop who raised his hand against her was now the one walking out with his head down. The board that thought it was untouchable was now just a group of people waiting for their turn to be called out. And she stood there quietly, letting their world collapse piece by piece, just like they tried to do to hers. This was her power, not noise, not rage, but the calm weight of truth crushing everything built on lies. And as the doors closed behind the officer, everyone in that room knew that the woman they thought was weak had just burned an entire empire without even raising her voice. The HOA president sat frozen like a statue as the officer was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her eyes wide and unfocused as if she was watching her world fall apart piece by piece, and the woman in the black suit stood quietly at the center of it all, not moving, not speaking, just watching their carefully built power collapse like a house of cards in a storm. Reporters rushed closer, their cameras flashing like lightning, whispers spread like fire through the packed courtroom, and the judge sat tall behind the bench with a face carved in cold authority. The board members who had walked in proud now sat like trapped animals, their shoulders hunched, their hands trembling, their voices stuck in their throats. This was the moment none of them ever thought would come. For years they had ruled the neighborhood with fear, issuing fake fines, threatening families, intimidating homeowners with police at their side, and laughing as people gave up. But today, everything was reversed. The judge leaned forward, his voice slow and sharp as a blade, and every word he spoke was like a hammer falling. For years, this board has operated beyond its limits. For years, it has acted like the law does not apply to it. But the law always comes back. His eyes flicked toward the HOA president, and she flinched like the words themselves had struck her. She opened her mouth to say something, but no sound came. Her perfect mask was gone. Gone was the cold smirk. Gone was the plastic confidence she wore like armor. All that remained was fear. The woman in black lowered her gaze slightly, not in weakness but with the calm of someone who had already won. She remembered every night spent sitting at her table alone, writing down every threat, every forged document, every violation they used to make her life miserable. She remembered when they sent police to her door just to scare her. She remembered how the officer who slapped her this morning stood there weeks ago smirking as they taped another fake fine on her door. They thought she was alone. They thought she was just one woman. But one woman was enough to destroy their little empire because she never gave up, never bent down, never stopped gathering proof. The judge motioned to the bailiff, and in seconds, 2 deputies walked toward the HOA president. Her eyes widened in panic, her hands tightened on the chair, and her voice finally cracked out a weak, "Wait, this is a mistake." But it was too late. The bailiff didn't pause. Her hands were pulled behind her back, and the sound of handcuffs locking echoed across the courtroom. The reporters erupted, their voices mixing with the loud clicking of cameras. The other board members shrank into their seats, pale and shaking, knowing they were next. The president turned her head toward the woman in black, her lips trembling. But the woman didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't move. She didn't need to. The truth was standing on her side. The judge looked down at the remaining members of the board. You all participated. Every one of you signed off on illegal actions. Every one of you believed power meant protection. But power without truth is nothing. His words were calm, but they struck harder than any shout could. One of the members broke down and started crying quietly. Another shook their head over and over, as if denying could erase the mountain of evidence stacked against them. The woman in black slowly took a breath, the first deep breath in months that didn't feel like she was choking on fear. She hadn't won by yelling or begging. She won by staying patient, by being smarter than the people who tried to destroy her. Her silence became her weapon, her proof became her voice, and the courtroom now echoed with everything they tried to bury. The judge's gavel slammed down once, hard, and the sharp sound ripped through the noise. "This court will proceed with full criminal charges," he declared, and the room shook with the weight of those words. The HOA president's head fell forward as she was led out of the courtroom like the officer before her. The other members didn't even try to run. They knew there was nowhere to go. Their own actions had built the cage they were trapped in. The people in the gallery stared at the woman in black like they were seeing her for the first time. Some whispered. Some nodded slowly. Others just stared in silence. She had walked into this place as someone they all thought was alone, powerless, beaten down. She now stood as the woman who brought down an entire corrupt system without raising her voice. The courtroom no longer belonged to the board, or the officer, or their fake power. It belonged to her. The judge gave her a single look, a look of respect, the kind given to someone who stood tall when everyone tried to push them down. And in that silent exchange, everything that needed to be said was already understood. The storm they created had swallowed them whole, and she was the one who had lit the match. The once proud HOA that ruled her neighborhood through fear was no more. In that room, they finally met someone they couldn't control, and that someone was the woman in the black suit who never bowed. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind the last of the arrested board members, and for the first time since the war with the HOA began, the air inside didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt clear, almost quiet, but not the kind of quiet that comes from fear. The kind that follows after a storm has torn everything down. Reporters were still talking in fast whispers, cameras still flashing, people still trying to process what they had just witnessed. The officer who once stood tall with his hand raised had walked out in handcuffs. The HOA president who once walked through the neighborhood like a queen was now facing a dozen criminal charges, and the rest of the board members sat pale, silent, and broken, knowing their world had just burned to ash. The woman in the black suit stood alone in the center of it all, steady and calm, her hands folded in front of her, her face unreadable but her eyes cold and sharp. She wasn't surprised. This was the moment she had been building toward for months. The judge leaned back in his chair, the echo of the gavel still ringing faintly in the room. He gave her a long, steady look, and in that silent exchange there was something unspoken: respect, acknowledgement, and a warning to those who thought the law could be twisted forever. He spoke slowly, each word cutting through the silence like a blade. "This case will be remembered," he said. "Not because of how it started, but because of how one person decided not to bend." The gallery shifted. Some nodded quietly, some stared at her with wide eyes. Others whispered like they were telling themselves they'd never forget what happened today. She lowered her gaze for a second, not because she felt small but because everything that had weighed on her for so long was finally lifting off her shoulders. She remembered the long nights sitting alone at her kitchen table with piles of files, replaying recorded threats over and over. She remembered standing outside her home while board members mocked her. She remembered when the officer slapped fake fines on her door, when neighbors avoided her out of fear, when the HOA made her life feel like a cage. But she didn't give up. She had endured their whispers, their power plays, their fake smiles, and their intimidation, not because she was weak but because she was preparing. The bailiff walked past her, giving her the smallest nod of respect. People who once doubted her now looked at her with quiet admiration. The neighborhood had watched her being dragged into this courtroom like she was the one on trial, but now they would watch the people who caused it face justice. This wasn't just her victory, it was a message to everyone who thought power was untouchable. The truth always finds its way. The HOA president was being loaded into a police van outside. Reporters swarmed her, shouting questions, but she didn't have answers anymore. All her lies, her control, her fake power, it was gone. Her empire of fear had lasted for years, but it only took one woman with evidence and iron will to bring it down. The officer who thought one slap would silence her was now the face of a scandal. Their little world of control had collapsed in front of flashing cameras. Back inside, The judge signed the final papers, and the courtroom slowly began to empty. She stayed for a moment, standing alone as the noise faded. It was strange. She had imagined this day for months, imagined cheering, shouting, or crying. But instead she felt something much stronger and quieter. Victory that didn't need noise. It was in the stillness. It was in the way everyone avoided meeting her eyes because they knew she wasn't the victim anymore. She was the storm that wiped out their fear. As she stepped toward the exit, reporters rushed to her, microphones raised, questions fired from every direction. She didn't give speeches, she didn't gloat, she didn't brag. She simply said, they thought silence meant weakness. They were wrong. That was all. Those few words hit harder than anything else she could have said. The cameras kept flashing, but she didn't stay for attention. She walked out through the courthouse doors with the same calm she had walked in with, except now the weight on her shoulders was gone. Outside, the neighborhood would change. People who had once been too afraid to speak up would see what happened today and realize they didn't have to be silent anymore. The HOA that had ruled with fear was no more. The officer who thought his badge gave him power was stripped of it. The president who believed she owned everyone was facing trial. And all of it began because one woman refused to bend. She walked down the courthouse steps slowly, the cold wind brushing against her face, but this time it didn't feel harsh. It felt like freedom. The sound of sirens faded into the distance. The crowd outside watched her pass like they were watching something larger than one person. They were watching proof that power built on fear can be broken. She didn't need to say anything else. Her silence had built this victory, and her silence would walk away with it too. This wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of something new. The neighborhood would never forget the day the board fell. The officer would never forget the day his slap backfired. And she, the woman in the black suit, would never forget the moment she walked out of the courtroom not as a victim, not as a target, but as the one who burned their entire corrupt system to the ground